this computer. Okay, welcome back, folks, to Political Economics, University of Pretoria 2021. Today we are going to cover a couple of papers on culture and African development. Let me share my screen. So we have already discussed which papers we are going to talk about today, number 1 and number 2, but there are other papers that might be of interest, folks. For instance, there is the paper by Stelios and Elias, which came out in Journal of Economic Literature in last year, in fact. And that's a good paper which summarizes a lot of the papers that we are actually covering in lectures. So it's a good paper to have at hand, right? Then there is a paper by Stelios and Elias again, which came out in 2014, QJE. We are not going to have time to discuss that paper, but I think it makes of an interesting read. They use the same data set that we have seen them using before, right? I think we have already covered a couple of papers by them. They use the same data set, the ethnic boundaries data set, right? So it's quite interesting. Then there is a paper, we don't have time to do that as well, but by Nathan and Leonard, which came out in AER 2011, the slave trade and the origins of mistrust in Africa. We did cover the slave trade last week, as you will recall. And we will also recall, I am sure, that because you have already read all those papers by now, you will also recall that in that paper by Nathan Nunn last week, that he hints at the importance of slavery creating mistrust in Africa, right? Because of the way slavery was implemented and carried in Africa. So this paper is essentially, again, it uses the same data set as the slave trades paper that we saw last week. Again, the importance, if you put a lot of effort in putting a data set together, the importance of making sure that that data set can be used for a couple or maybe 3 or 4 papers. There are increasing returns to scale in doing that. And then there is also a paper that you're not going to see, and I think that's it, yeah, by Nathan Alesina and Paola Giuliano on the origins, which came out in QJE 2013, on the origins of gender roles, women and the plow. This is a very interesting paper that you perhaps should take a look at. Again, because it's about the role of having particular technologies in agriculture and how those technologies define gender roles, right, in the labor market, essentially. Okay, very interesting because it's still relevant for us to understand the role of women in some societies. Okay, let me go to the first paper, folks. Here it is, and the annotated version of this paper is available from my website. You can simply download. We have the same version that I have in front of me. As I said, this paper came in JPE 2014. It says 51 pages there, folks, so it's a lot to read, but it's a very nice paper, and you actually learn quite a lot reading this paper. It's very nicely written. Okay, we have there Daron, Tristan, and James. Abstract is there, Chiefs, Economic Development and Elite Control of Civil Society in Sierra Leone. So they use Sierra Leonean data, but they stress in the paper that this is a paper that can be used to understand, can be generalized, right, to understand other African societies as well. What do? The research question, they study the effect of constraints on chiefs' power, right? On chiefs' power, on economic outcomes, on particular economic outcomes, such as provision of particular public goods, such as health and education. Citizens' attitudes, so how people see authority, right? And also social capital. What is the importance of social capital? Well, social capital is important because if you have more social capital, you know more people, you interact with more people, and therefore you can transact with more people. So what is this? The research question, constraints on chiefs' power and their effects on certain outcomes, right? What we are really interested in, I think, is the effect of constraints on chiefs' power and how that sort of constraint affects provision of public goods. And then they give a little bit of background. Chiefs in Sierra Leone, who are these people? Who are they, right? In the second sentence of the abstract, they give a little bit of background, and then they are going to give a lot of background later on in the paper. A paramount chief in Sierra Leone must come from a ruling family, right? So it's endogenous. Originally recognized by, guess whom? By British colonial authorities, right? Again, I don't want to give right now too much detail, right? But we are going to see more of that in a few moments, right? So essentially, it is endogenous. For you to become a chief in Sierra Leone, you must come from a particular family, which essentially had to be recognized by the former colonial authority or power, which in Sierra Leone happened to be the British. A little bit more of background. Actually, now they give this third sentence. They give the results in chiefdoms with fewer ruling families. This paper is very much about using the first principles to make sense of an interesting research question, right? Which is essentially supply and demand. In chiefdoms with fewer ruling families, there is less political competition. Well, fewer ruling families, they compete against each other, right? If there are fewer ruling families, therefore there is less political competition in that particular chiefdom. And consequently, therefore, certain outcomes are worse today. So in chiefdoms with fewer ruling families, chiefs face less political competition and development outcomes are significantly worse today. So what are they saying here, folks? Is that, again, is essentially what they're saying, that in chiefdoms, in regions, in areas where there are less ruling families, more ruling families imply more debate, more bargaining within the ruling families, right? Less ruling families imply less debate, less bargaining, right? Therefore, less ruling families, less political competition, less bargaining happening there, and therefore worse development outcomes that we don't know which these development outcomes are, but we are going to see in a few moments, and worse development outcomes today. Okay. What is there? Some intuition behind the results. The word capture appears. So they argue that these results reflect the capture of civil society organization by chiefs. So that is an implication coming out of the results, how in regions with less ruling families, there is less political competition, there is less bargaining, and how in these areas the chiefs manage to capture civil society organization, right? And how they manage to affect the implementation of policies. And that's why it's so important to understand the importance of these people. If you are implementing a policy in somewhere in South Africa, if there are chiefs around, what is their role, what is their importance, because that can affect how a policy will be implemented. So introduction, folks. So let me do the introduction and then we stop for questions. They give in the first paragraph, they give some background because not everyone knows much about the role of chiefs in African societies, or the role of chiefs in Afghanistan as we speak, right? Some background of the role of chiefs. The lowest layer of government in most sub-Saharan African, henceforth African countries, is occupied by traditional rulers or chiefs, as we call them. Chiefs raise taxes. They control the judicial system. Sometimes they are the judicial system, and they allocate land, right? And they allocate land, and that happens also in South Africa. The most important resource in the rural areas, land, right? Most African countries are still very rural. Most of the population live in rural areas. So that also in South Africa, less so. There are more and more people living in cities, but in other African countries, most people still are in the countryside. So despite their central role in African society, so now a little bit of motivation. Despite their central role in African society, relatively little is known about how chiefs exercise their political and economic power, how and whether they are accountable to their communities. Well, it depends, right? And the effects of constraints on their power on economic development. So they are essentially telling us that the chiefs are important. They are an important institutions. They play an important role, for instance, in allocating land, or even in allowing people to sell or to buy land in their area of influence. But at the same time, they are saying in the second sentence, they are saying that very little is known. So they are essentially motivating their own paper, okay? And then, folks, research question. In this paper, they use the colonial. How do they go about? No, they need data on the families, right? They use the colonial organization of the chieftaincy in Sierra Leone, so there is boundaries, to study the impact of constraints on chiefs' power on economic outcomes, citizens' attitudes towards authority, and social capital. Okay, so a little bit more of background. Colonial power, chiefs, local government institutions. In 1896, British colonial authorities empowered a set of paramount chiefs as the sole authority of local government in the newly created Sierra Leone Protectorate. Okay. Not in 1996, folks, in 1896. The paramount chiefs and the sub-chiefs and headmen, right? So there is a hierarchy of people. Under them remained effectively the only institution of local government until the World Bank sponsored the creation of a system of elected local councils in 2004, right? These paramount chiefs are elected for life by a tribal authority made up of local notables. Only individuals from the designated ruling families, right? As I said, it's a very endogenous process of a chieftaincy. So there are ruling families, and only people coming from those ruling families of a chieftaincy, the elite created and given exclusive right to rule by the British at the initiation of the system in 1896, are eligible. So you must be eligible to become a paramount chief. So the paramount chief is elected, but it's the sample of people who can actually run for that role is limited in terms of whether you are part or not part of those families. So it's an endogenous process. Okay. Hypothesis: the greater the number of ruling families, the greater the extent of political competition, and the more constraints the chiefs will be. So they hypothesize that the greater the number of ruling families in a chieftaincy, the greater the extent of political competition, right? And it makes sense, it's about quantities. And the more constraints will be placed on the power of a ruling chief. I think this is essentially what economics is about, right? It's supply and demand of people, supply and demand of something. So the more people in a chieftaincy, the more ruling families in a particular area. Again, the more ruling families, the more debate happens, and essentially more bargaining happens, and therefore probably putting the argument upside down, better development outcomes today. So they are going to see hypothesis: political competition, provision of public goods. With more ruling families in a chieftaincy, a successful candidate will have to satisfy a greater plurality of interests or bargaining, right? There will be a lot of people sitting in this council, and a lot of different interests and a lot of bargaining happening there. Plurality of interests to be elected. Even if one family is able to dominate the chieftains for many generations, with more ruling families, there will be a greater potential for the incumbent to lose the paramount chieftaincy in an election, right? This creates a powerful threat that will discipline paramount chiefs, forcing them to govern better. I think this is very important, folks. It is very important. We have to make sense of this. We have to try to make local sense of this. A lot of people in this country say that the Western Cape is better than Gauteng, and I think in some areas they are, right? But frankly, a township in the Western Cape is pretty bad. Township in Gauteng is pretty bad too. At that level, bad is bad. But some other areas, the Western Cape is better. It does better. And why is that? Is it because the DA is better than the ANC? Well, it's not really that case, folks. It's just that the DA faces a lot of competition. If the DA doesn't do a reasonably decent job, the ANC will come back. So they face competition. So they have to do slightly better. And that's exactly what these guys are essentially saying about the role of chiefs and about the role of democracy, right? On the other hand, in other provinces, the ANC doesn't face a lot of competition, so they don't have the incentive to do a decent job. They are not threatened by anyone or by anything. There is very little political competition in Gauteng, for instance. Okay, or even in the interior of the country, very little. So they have think always in terms of how democracy works, or how this sort of power works, right? And how bargaining happens, and how interests have to be accommodated, and how political competition works. And ultimately how incentives work. So hypothesis B, the more ruling families, the more political competition, the better the allocation of public goods. So again, the more ruling families in a chieftaincy, the more interests to be accommodated, the more bargaining. There's a lot of bargaining happening there, and therefore the better allocation of public goods. The chiefs will actually have to do, will have to accommodate different interests, otherwise they can actually lose their power because there are other ruling families around. They further hypothesize following Becker, Stigler, and Whitman that the greater competition brought about by more ruling families will promote efficiency. So I'm just repeating myself here, right? Or restrict the distortions following from the unchecked power of chiefs. For example, it's always important in science to give examples, right? Chiefs constrained by greater competition will be less able to manipulate access to land for their own benefit, or will have to compete by offering and providing public goods in the same way that political parties or lobbies constrained by competition are, as in the model of blah, 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 right? In the same way, right? And that's important. In the same way that political parties, we were just talking about ANC and DA, or particular lobbies constrained by competition are. Okay. Okay, but then how do they go about this thing, folks? To measure the number of families, right? That's the important thing now. They conducted a survey in 2011 of encyclopedias. Who are the encyclopedias? The name given in Sierra Leone to elders who preserve the oral history of the chieftaincy. So it's all about a sort of Talmudic tradition or oral history of the chieftaincy, right? And the elders in all of the ruling families in all 149 chieftaincies. There are 149 chieftaincies in Sierra Leone. While the government maintains no official list of families, so there are no official list of families, there is broad agreement within chiefdoms about the identity and number of families within each region. They used the survey to reconstruct the history of the chieftaincy for as far back as our respondents or the encyclopedias could recall. The history included the names of the paramount chiefs, which ruling family they were from, and when available, the dates on which they were elected. Remember, to become a chief, you must come from a particular family, right? They also collected information on the origins of the chieftaincy and of each of the ruling families. They used the archives of the Sierra Leone National Archive, situated in Fura Bay College, as well as provincial secretary archives in Kenema, the National Archives in London, and available secondary sources to cross-check the results of the survey. And to the best of their knowledge, they are boosting a little bit. They are the first to have constructed a comprehensive history of the chieftaincy in Sierra Leone. Essentially, folks, a lot of work was put together there. Okay, in actually collecting this data about the families. What else I found interesting in the introduction? First set, okay, results, political competition, provision of public goods, urbanization. First set of empirical results focuses on educational. Remember, public goods provision is essentially education and health. Focus on educational, health, and economic outcomes. They find a significant positive relationship between the number of ruling families, so more ruling families, and human capital outcomes. Human capital outcomes, education and health, such as literacy and educational attainment. So more ruling families, better outcomes. And also if the proportion of people working outside agriculture. We know that agricultural work is there is only one thing that is worse than agricultural work, and that is having to work in the mines, right? So a proxy for development is usually work in those societies. It's either urbanization or the ability to work outside agriculture, right? Which is a useful proxy for economic development. There are no nationally representative microdata on incomes in Sierra Leone, so there is no income data in there. Results again, political competition, literacy and health from the bottom. Let's see, I think it starts, okay. Oh. Okay, moving from the bottom quartile to the top quartile, from 1.8 ruling families to 7.7 ruling families. So you can see that there are less ruling families, more ruling families, corresponds to an increase in literacy in primary and secondary school attainment of about 7 percentage points, and in non-agricultural employment of 2.3 percentage points. In all cases, from relatively low basis, right? For instance, 37% and 11% for literacy and non-agricultural employment, respectively. So more ruling families, better outcomes today. They also find a substantial positive association between the number of ruling families and various measures of child health, asset wealth is essential income, and housing quality, right? More results, political competition and land allocation. Given that chiefs control access to land, which is not held as private property in rural Sierra Leone, an important mechanism is the relationship between the power of chiefs and the security of property rights in land. What do they do? Using information from a nationally representative survey of agricultural households, they find that chiefs in chiefdoms with fewer ruling families, less competition, have more authority to influence whether or not people can farm or sell a piece of land, and that this authority is particularly strong if the people concerned were not born in the chiefdom. Right. More results, political competition and obedience. Right? An influential line of argument in political economy maintains that autocratic power of politicians and elites both results from and leads to low social capital and civil participation. Right? It's I always recall our president telling us, "I told you so." All right, you should have been wearing masks, but you didn't. So now you deserve the lockdown. Right? But in a very paternalistic way, not in a democratic way. So an inflation line of argument in political economy maintains that autocratic power, yes, autocratic power of politicians and elites, both results from and leads to low social capital and civic participation. Interestingly, they find exactly the opposite in the data, right? Places with fewer ruling families or less competition exhibit greater social capital on dimensions such as attendance at community meetings, participation in social groups, and the undertaking of collective actions. They are going to make more of that in the next paragraph, but essentially this, if there are less ruling families, They are saying that if there are less ruling families, people participate more in social events or in political events, right? But this is essentially, they're going to say now, intuition, less political competition, more obedience, or less debate. So people feel forced to behave well. So this somewhat puzzling finding, they suggest, arises because more dominant chiefs, where there are less ruling families, have been better able to mold civil society and institutions of civic participation in their villages for their own benefit and continued dominance in a way that appears consistent with the case study literature on Sierra Leone. As a consequence, relatively high measures of civic participation in villages with less constrained paramount chiefs or less ruling families are not a sign of vibrant civil society disciplining politicians, but of a dysfunctional civil society captured by elites. Again, this again is very important, right? Because I seem to recall when I came to South Africa in 2007, a number of colleagues and a number of students I had at the time, talking to students, they were all very worried that Becky was the president at the time, but they were all very worried that someone else would become the president at some point, and that someone else became the president in 2009. And everybody knew that the someone else was bound to do strange things once in power. A lot of people knew that, but he became the president anyway. And there were always, and there are always people showing obedience to the former president, even if that former president was not terribly popular outside Kandla. Again, those things are very interesting, folks, because again, there are interesting research questions at our very level here, right? That it's up to you to think about. But in places where paramount chiefs are less constrained, less families, they are more dependent on chiefs' patronage and favors, and thus may find it useful to make specific investments in the system, right? So what else? And then we stop for a talk. Context. In this light, it should not be a surprise that our findings are consistent with those of several studies of the political economy of Africa and support the widely held but untested, so they are the ones testing, belief that the creation of unaccountable chiefs during the colonial period has had negative consequences for development. In Sierra Leone, predatory behavior by the chiefs is deemed to have been so severe that it's argued to have been a major cause of the civil war that erupted in 1991, right? What else we have there, folks? I think that is pretty much it. Historical background, a little bit of context. I'm not going to spend too much time on the historical background because I was told once that you don't need me to tell you about your history. So let me stop sharing and see if there are questions. Questions, comments, suggestions?
Just an interesting comment. In South Africa, we have like a lot of political parties, but we can see the issues of like corruption is still high. Wouldn't we say that since we have like a lot of political parties who have political competition and would expect things like corruption to go down? Or is it because these political parties, maybe some of them, they don't have enough number of seats in parliament to make decisions?
Thanks, Deron. That's what I think too. There are lots of political parties, right? But there is one main dominant party, and there is actually one main dominant alliance, which is essentially the alliance we have in power. I think it's very fragmented, in fact, right? We don't have two very strong political parties like in the United States, for instance, or in the United Kingdom. Right, the United States, the GOP and the Democrats, and then in the UK, the Labour Party and the Conservatives. In Germany, there are also two strong parties, the Social Democrats and the Socialist Party. In South Africa, as I said, the example, the DA is an important political party, but it's very regional. The DA doesn't have a lot of penetration outside the Western Cape. So it doesn't really dent the ANC outside the Western Cape. And the DA, on the other hand, has the ANC in the Western Cape. The ANC is strong. The ANC is strong in any place, right? It has a huge base of people. But the DA the DA faces a lot of political competition in the Western Cape, where they are in power. But the ANC doesn't face a lot of very little political competition in the other provinces, and that is the incentive, or the lack of incentives happening there. But yeah, you are absolutely right. A lot of political parties, but very fragmented political parties, very small political parties, which don't really play a role in affecting how policies are implemented. More questions, more comments? Okay, let me continue. And then if there are, you just give me a shout. Okay, historical background, folks. Let me see what if I highlighted something, but there is really a lot of information, especially James Robinson. He knows a lot about African development and about how African societies work, the intricacies of African societies. He is always well, before last year, he was always he's got friends all over the place, right? He's friends with chiefs, he's friends with a lot of people. So he knows a lot of African history because he travels a lot, right? Let me see. Okay, historical background, folks. You don't need me to tell your history. I was told that once, so let's keep like that. But if you read this paper, it is very interesting, folks. It's really interesting because we can actually learn something. In terms of data, documenting chieftaincy institutions. So how is that they put this data set together? By the way, this data is available. But the interesting thing to do would be to have similar data for different places, because I think they've done a lot with this data. To measure the power of the various paramount chiefs, they created, to their knowledge, the first comprehensive list of ruling families. So they have a list of ruling families across chiefdoms, right? And the first comprehensive history of the chieftaincy in Sierra Leone. So they have the list of families across different chiefdoms, right? More data, educational and health outcomes, attitudes and property rights on land. They study the effect of the number of ruling families, right? They have a list of these ruling families on a wide range of development and social outcomes. The primary data source are the 2004 Sierra Leone census about the outcomes, right? The 2008 Demographic and Health Survey, the DHS. And I think if you are doing microeconometrics with Steve, I think he uses the DHS in his lectures, I think. The 2007 National Public Services Survey and the 2010 Agricultural Household Tracking Survey. They use the census to study education and employment outcomes. So they are using those more traditional data sets for the outcomes. And the DHS to study health outcomes of children under age 5. They use the NPS to study attitudinal and social capital outcomes, as well as housing quality and asset ownership. And the ATS to study property rights of landholders. Finally, they also use the 1963 census for a cohort analysis of human capital to investigate when the gap between chiefdoms with high and low development outcomes began to occur. Descriptive stats, we don't need that, but though you have to take a look at that. That's the chiefdoms in Sierra Leone, right? Let me see what else I found interesting. Aha. Concentration of power. So remember, they are going to use a variable when they run their regressions, which is essentially whether there are more or less ruling families in a particular chiefdom. And essentially, you can actually get a measure that calculates concentration of power. You can get a measure that calculates inequality of power, for instance. You can calculate the Gini coefficient if you wanted inequality of something, but they want concentration of power, number of families in chiefdom. So to measure the concentration of power, they construct a Herfindahl index. So it's the name of an index that you can use. It's a standard index that you can just put your data on Stata, and you ask Stata to calculate the Herfindahl index. They didn't invent the Herfindahl index, right? It's an index that exists in the literature to actually, which is I think it was used a lot, and I think it is still used in the literature on industrial organization to calculate industry concentration, right? So they construct a Herfindahl index of the extent to which the office of paramount chief has been dominated by a subset of ruling families over time. Okay? To see if it's the same family over time, or if or whether there is being changes over time. Aha. Specification OLS, how concentration of power is put together to describe the link. So to describe the link between the number of families and the concentration of power. So how is that they actually construct the Herfindahl index, which is the HC there. They run OLS regressions, and that is the regression. They say they abuse notation slightly and let FC, where is FC? FC is there, stand for either the number of ruling families, so the number of ruling families in chiefdom C, or its log, depending on the specification, right? So it's essentially the Herfindahl index is given by the number of ruling families. The delta, where is delta? Is over there. Denote full set of 12 district fixed effects. So they have fixed effects there. NC, where is NC? NC is there. Is the number of chiefs in the history of the chieftaincy that the oral historians or the encyclopedias could remember in chiefdom C. And amalgamations. There is a dummy variable equal to 1 if the chieftaincy was amalgamated at some point in history, and equal to 0 otherwise. And epsilon is the usual error time. Okay. So that's how they act. That's how they calculate, folks, the index, the concentration index. Okay. Table 2 results number of ruling families against concentration of power. So they are just showing the previous OLS regression. Those are not the main results that we are interested in. They are just showing us that number of ruling families or the number of ruling families in logs, the first two variables there, they against the Herfindahl office holding concentration index. And you can see that the more ruling families, the lower the index. Let's see what's happening here. So that graph is comes straight from Stata. You can recognize the Stata there. Again, concentration of power and number of ruling families. So on the horizontal, we have a number of ruling families. So more ruling families correlates negatively with concentration of power. Okay, on the vertical. Table 3, specification development outcomes against concentration of power. Table 3 presents regressions. Okay, here are the results that we are interested in. Where that's a regression. Number 2, that's a regression of interest, where YC is the dependent variable of interest. The specifications include baseline controls for amalgamation, the number of ruling families and district fixed effects, and epsilon is the error term. The objective is to examine whether the log number of ruling families, right, is meaningfully correlated with measures of pre-colonial economic development or potential determinants of subsequent development. Okay, let me change this a little bit. Let me rotate clockwise. Okay, so here table 3 is lots of results, more ruling families, higher literacy. So what, let me do like this. Number of ruling families and correlates of early development. I think the one I am particularly interested here, folks, is the last one on the right. A number of ruling families against predicted literacy, and the correlation is positive. What else? Let me counterclockwise. Let's see more results. Results again, where YIC denotes, I denotes individual and C the chieftaincy, and YIC is the dependent variable of interest, which is many of their specifications is a dummy variable, making this relationship equivalent to a LPM model. Then everything else there is fixed effects. They have a bunch of controls there, but we don't need to go through all this paragraph. Let's see. There we go. I feel more comfortable with numbers. Main results: political competition, education, always positive. Again, folks, we have different variables for education: literacy, primary school attainment, and secondary school attainment. And then we have number of families in logs, or number of ruling families in logs, or number of ruling families in levels, and number of in logs. The more ruling families, the better literacy, the better primary school attainment, the better secondary school attainment, right? Again, the important thing here is the intuition, right? It's very easy to, those are all correlations. So the more ruling families, that means more competition, right? There are more ruling families, that means that there is more need for debates and for bargaining. There is more bargaining happening. So the chief in power is more constrained by the number of ruling families in his chiefdom, right? And therefore, this chief in power has to offer these ruling families something, and in terms of public goods, and the public good being offered here is education, right? And then, folks, there is a second, health outcomes for children under 5. The first variable is weight for height, how developed those kids are. And the second one is moderate to severe anemia. So number of ruling families is always positive against, and significant, always positive against weight for height. So kids are taller. And negative, as we expect, right? In terms of moderate to severe anemia. So there is less anemia in kids under 5, given the number of ruling families. Again, given political competition. More results, political competition, urbanization, which is a proxy for development. So again, number of ruling families correlates positively with non-agricultural employment, which is the first one there. Correlates positively also with housing quality and with wealth. Okay. Again, more ruling families, more political competition, more compromises in place. Let's see what else we have there, folks. Property rights results. Number of ruling families against permission from chief and right to sell. Okay, so more ruling families, the less the need of having permission from chief to do whatever they want to do with the land. And more ruling families correlates positively with the right to sell a piece of land. Okay. So it gives more, political competition gives more flexibility in what to do with the land. What else we have there? Attitudes, results, political competition, attitudes again, or how people behave. Number of ruling families. So that's the question there. Agree one should respect authority. Agree only older people can lead, right? And all the correlations are negative. So the more ruling families, the number of ruling families correlates negatively with respect towards authority, and more respect towards authority, right? What else I found? Good news, we are on page 44. When you know, you know. Concluding remarks and implications. When you don't know, folks, you can spend 5 weeks covering this paper, right? And then the course is done. And instead of covering 12 papers in 6 weeks, you cover 2. In Africa, more broadly, where a majority of the population lives in rural areas, South Africa is an exception, and where the national state often lacks the capacity. So there is also the importance of state capacity in there. So and we saw a couple of papers on state capacity already. So all those things, they are linked. And the power to penetrate society institutions of local governance may be pivotal in shaping development outcomes, right? And the chiefs are very local. Yet they have received little systematic empirical investigation. Further, though the institution of the chieftaincy in its modern form was often a creation of the colonial state, and there have been attempts to demolish it, chiefs still exercise considerable power across the continent, right? As I said at the beginning, the chiefs were there before, they were there during, and they are still there. So we have to take them into account when making decisions. Using this measure of, remember the measure, the Herfindahl index for power concentration, they show that for those born in places where there are fewer ruling families, less competition, a variety of development outcomes are significantly worse, right? More political competition, illustrated here by the number of ruling families, leads to better development outcomes. What they argue is that less constrained chiefs who face greater political competition, I think there is a typo there, lead to worse development outcomes because they are freer to distort incentives to engage in economically undesirable activities through their control of land, taxation, regulation, and the judicial system. There is a problem here, right? I think there is a typo, more than a typo here. They put things upside down here. So be aware of that. An obvious interpretation of their result is that they are a confirmation and extension of the intuition of Becker, Stiglitz, and Whitman, that political competition functions like market competition to promote efficiency. Where there is more competition, there are better outcomes. Even under the chieftaincy institutions in Sierra Leone that deviate quite radically from those that these authors were concerned with, it turns out that their intuition applies. In contrast to expectations that would naturally follow from these findings, they also found that chieftaincies with fewer ruling families, less competition, have greater levels of both bonding and bridging social capital. Remember, fewer ruling families, there is actually more control over civic society, and people feel compelled to participate in particular events, generally believed to be associated with better accountability, good governance, and superior development outcomes. One interpretation of these two sets of findings is that chiefs who face fewer constraints because there are less families build social capital as a way to control and monitor society. This mechanism may also induce people to invest in patron-client relations with powerful chiefs, thus giving them a vested interest in the institution. What else in the conclusion, and then we have a break in a matter of 5 minutes. Most policy, international organizations, IMF and World Bank, decentralization in terms of provision of public goods, chiefs at the local level. Most significantly, folks, a bit of policy prescription here or policy implication here. Their findings raise the possibility that ideas on the relationship between the nature of politics and social capital developed with reference to societies with advanced economies and relatively strong institutions may have limited applicability to politics in Africa, or at the very least in Sierra Leone. So what are they saying here, folks, is that a policymaker in Washington, D.C. perhaps will not get things totally right if they don't, or he, she, them, do not understand, doesn't understand how things work on the ground. They also suggest caution in the implementation of certain popular policies, for instance, fiscal decentralization. For instance, many international aid agencies are now heavily involved in attempts to strengthen civil society and build social capital in the hope that this will increase local accountability and public goods provision. So we have to be aware, we have to be cognizant of the role of chiefs in particular societies. And then the references, yeah. And I don't think this paper has appendix. The appendix is probably online. Okay, folks, let me go all the way up and let me stop sharing. And let me see, folks, if you guys have questions, comments, before we have our break. Questions, comments? All clear? Okay, let's break for 10 minutes. That clock is a bit wrong, actually. So we come back at 25 past. Okay, let's break for 10 minutes. Let me stop recording. Let me pause recording now. There we go. Welcome back to Political Economics, University of Pretoria. And folks, let's go straight into our second paper. There we go. We've done this one. Okay. So we're going to do the second one, which is this one, which came out in Econometrica 2017, the evolution of culture and institutions. Evidence from the Cuba Kingdom. Cuba Kingdom is where, it's not the whole region, but it's where the DRC is now, by Sarah. She's not at Bocconi University anymore. She's at University of California, San Diego, I think. Nathan Nunn is still at Harvard. James Robinson is at Chicago, and Jonathan Weigel, he is at the London School of Economics now. Let's see what this paper is about. Let's see what this paper is about. I think this is a classical paper that I think usually when we start with an idea, for a paper, we have a set of hypotheses in our minds, and we have in our minds at least a vague idea of what we expect in terms of results. We have, ideally, we don't have priors, but I think every academic has a prior, right? And I think this is the classical paper which I remember having a conversation with James in Joburg in 2019, and about this paper, and he said, no, Manuel, when we started, we had no priors, but that's what all academics will tell you, right? All good academics will tell you. But I think this is the classical paper which I think they started with a prior, and the results didn't come out according to their priors, and then they had to come up with an explanation for the results. But let's see how compelling this paper is. Again, this my job here, folks, is just to introduce you to this literature, to these papers coming out in very top journals in our profession, in Econometrica. right? And being put together by very senior people, Nathan Nunn and James Robinson, and also by two very promising young assistant professors, Sarah and Jonathan. Okay. I think Sarah and Jonathan were PhD students of Nathan at the time. Okay. So the importance of having good PhD supervisors. What do? The research question is state centralization and cultural norms. They use variation in historical state centralization in the Cuba Kingdom and in areas just outside the kingdom, right, which didn't have state centralization, to examine the long-term impact of institutions on cultural norms. And a little bit of context: Cuba Kingdom, state and institutions. The Cuba Kingdom established in Central Africa in the early 17th century by King Cheyenne. Had more developed state institutions than the other independent villages and chieftaincies in the region or just outside the kingdom. It had an unwritten constitution, separation of political powers, a judicial system with courts and juries, police force, military, taxation, significant public goods provision, right? All the things that we expect from governments. Comparing, so what is that they do? Results: comparing people from the Cuba Kingdom to others just outside the Cuba Kingdom. Cuba people are associated with less rule following and greater propensity to cheat. So we would expect the other way around, right? That people from the Cuba Kingdom, which have been exposed to institutions, they would be more inclined to follow rules. Right, but that doesn't seem to be the case. And then I'll try to give you, as we move along, I'll try to give you a very loose example of countries that I'm familiar with. Mechanism: this finding is consistent, defining that Cuba citizens or people now who are descendants of Cuba citizens, right? They tend to, they are more inclined to follow less the rules. Okay, this finding is consistent with recent models where endogenous investments to inculcate values in children decline when there is an increase in the effectiveness of formal institutions that enforce socially desirable behavior. So what they are saying here is a bit cryptic. I find this sentence a little bit cryptic. So let's try to make sense of it. So they are saying that parents, so they are talking about people now, right? They collected this data now. People now who are descendants of the old Cuba Kingdom, they tend they tend not to follow rules. Okay, rules. And they try to make sense of that because we would expect it the other way around. So people who have been exposed to institutions for longer, they are more used to particular institutions, and they are more used to rules and regulations, and they will keep following those rules and regulations. They will actually be quite smart in making use of the system, right? But that's not what they find. And one way they come up to explain this sort of unexpected behavior, although James said that they had no priors, is to say that in those societies, the Cuba descendants, it's like saying that, okay, English people, they have been exposed to the English common law for centuries, but now the English parents, they assume that the English government will inculcate those rules and those norms, those social norms in those English kids, and then therefore they don't do that themselves. That's what they are saying, right? This finding is consistent with recent models where endogenous investments to inculcate values in children decline when there is an increase in the effectiveness of formal institutions, right? So that's, but they are going to explore better as we move along. The research question, they studied the effect that institutions have on culture, right? Hypothesis: stronger institutions inculcate people with norms. There are a variety of plausible, that's what we would be expecting, right? There are a variety of plausible ways that institutions could affect cultural traits. One possibility is that stronger institutions inculcate cultural values that further reinforce the institutions themselves, right? I think that's the most intuitive way. For example, if institutions incentivize people to engage in a pattern of behavior, this may in turn cause individuals to view this pattern of behavior as a natural or normal, and to experience this utility when they deviate from this behavior. For instance, you go to Germany and you're going to see that the Germans, they tend to follow some rules. They don't follow all rules, right? But they tend to follow. One rule that really strikes me as very interesting, the way they follow, is they really stop when call them here robots, and the robots, when the traffic lights tell them to stop, the pedestrians, right? Even if there are no cars coming, if the traffic lights tell them to stay put, they stay put, right? Even if there is no one looking, they stay put, right? So that's what they are saying there, right? That people get inculcated by particular social norms or cultural norms or behavior, right? But then there is another possibility. The hypothesis: stronger institutions undermine rule following. Another possibility is that institutions associated with state formation undermine norms of rule following. There are a number of different theoretical mechanisms that generate such an effect, and then they are going to explain, because that's what they find, right? Is that as I said, parents, descendants of the Cuba Kingdom, they do not really inculcate those rules and regulations on their kids, because they assume that the government will be doing that. So let's see. A counterexample of the German example here would be the English, right? The English, when they don't really, they are not very careful when crossing the street, right? And they've been exposed to the English common law for centuries. Okay. The English in England. Let's be clear about that. The research question in this paper, they examine the effect of institutions on culture by providing an empirical study of the long-term impact of state formation on individuals' propensity to follow rules and obey laws. And it is long run, because they are going to use descendants and non-descendants, contemporaneously speaking, of the Cuba Kingdom, which is something of the past. The analysis: context, geography, data, Cuba against adjacent areas. Their analysis exploits variation from an historical natural experiment in Central Africa, the creation of the Cuba Kingdom in the 17th century. So they are going to compare Cuba descendants with non-Cuba descendants, right? And how they follow or don't follow rules and laws and the rule of law. A little bit of context: Cuba Kingdom institutions. Cuba Kingdom had many characteristics that are associated with modern states, making the estimated effects of the Cuba state on cultural norms of general interest. It's always interesting to put a paper together that has general interest. Okay. The kingdom had a professional bureaucracy, a system of taxation, extensive public goods provision, an unwritten constitution, sophisticated legal system that featured trial by jury and courts of appeal, a professional police force, and a military. Amongst travelers and ethnographers of the Cuba Kingdom, comparisons have regularly been made to other centralized states like Augustan Rome, Imperial Japan, or the ancient Egyptian civilization. What else? Data. Now the next paragraph is they are going to talk about the data, the experiment, because they put some people together. People from Cuba Kingdom and people from just outside the kingdom, cultural norms, game theory. There is a game theory experiment happening there. The analysis compares, I'm just repeating myself now, the analysis compares individuals whose ancestors lived within the Cuba kingdom to individuals whose ancestors live just outside the kingdom, just outside the border. And test for differences in the propensity to follow rules, even when there is a strong monetary incentive to not to do so. How do they do that? So they put a bunch of people in a lab, right? Just like the lab we have at the University of Pretoria. And then they ask these people to run, they run a survey with these people, right? They measure rule following using two sets of behavioral experiments. The first is the resource allocation game. I'm sure you have seen this in microeconomics at some point, either with Nikki or with Alex, I don't know, or with Jesse. In the experiment, there is a cost to following the rules and a benefit to cheating, right? Although it's impossible for us or anyone else to know if any specific individual cheats, they are able to measure whether groups of individuals, right, cheat by observing aggregate outcomes in a larger sample. Second experiment is a version of the standard ultimatum game. Again, I'm sure I hope have heard of the ultimatum game. I did when I was a master's student, in which participants physically allocate money in a private setting rather than play on a computer. This provides an opportunity for individuals to steal money during the experiment. What else? Results: Cuban ancestry is associated with more rule breaking, not rule following. Using the experimental measures of rule following, a consistent and robust set of empirical results emerge. They find that Cuban ancestry is associated with more rule breaking and more theft. This is true for both experiments and for all three samples of interest. These findings demonstrate that culture can be shaped by state institutions, and that, at least in this instance, state institutions and culture are not complements, right? And that's an important thing. That's an important statement, right? That institutions and culture are not complements, as hypothesized by Elias, Weber, and Foucault. But instead are substitutes, as predicted in a model of Tabellini 2008. Therefore, their results are more consistent with the Cuban state crowding out internal norms of rule following. So they're going to elaborate a little bit later on this, when they say that essentially parents of descendants of the Cuba kingdom, they assume that rule following will be inculcated by the state. So there is a bit of a crowding out there. One waits for the other. What else I found interesting? Oh, that's strange. That's already number 3. Wait a moment. Did I jump? Oh, that is the historical background, right? Which I think I jumped. So there is the historical background. There is always a historical background section, right, folks? If you write a paper about South Africa, you also need a historical background, because nobody, a lot of people know about Nelson Mandela. Nelson Mandela became a brand for democracy and equal rights. But apart from that, nobody really, very few people outside South Africa and very few people inside South Africa to understand what South Africa is about. So always try to give a sort of historical background. Do not assume that people will know much about South Africa, right? Data collection, then they describe the experiments. They already show some, let me see. Cuba ancestry is associated with missing money, propensity to cheat. Let's see what's happening here, folks. They are just showing the data, right? And you see that's a very nice way of showing the data. I'll say that this is yellow, right? And the other one is gray. So yellow is Cuba ethnicity, and the gray is non-Cuba. Average amount allocated to other party, you see that in the ultimatum game, average amount of money allocated to other parties is always lower if you are from the Cuba ethnicity. And then we have here average amount allocated to other part again. Now they disaggregate the data in different groups, but it's the lowest if you are Cuba ethnicity. And here, average amount missing is higher if you are from the Cuba ethnicity compared to other. This is just descriptives, but compared to other ethnicities just outside the Cuba Kingdom. Just descriptives, they are just showing the data. Table 1, baseline estimates in the RAG and ultimate game with theft. Results, Cuba ancestors sharing and money missing. So let's see what is that we get in these regressions. Okay, there is the Cuba ethnicity indicator, and it correlates negatively with average amount allocated to other party, right? As we just seen above, and it correlates positively with amount of money missing in the ultimatum game. Okay. Okay, those are the baseline estimates which you have just seen, but that's the regression they run. Specification where I indexes individuals, so they have individual data, right? Because they are putting people, let's say, for one of the experiments, they are putting people in a lab, and then they in front of a computer or in front of they give them paper survey, and they ask them to ask particular questions. Where I indexes individuals, I Cuba is an indicator variable that equals 1, is a dummy. If individuals I self-reported ethnicity is Cuba. The vector of individuals level covariates, so there is a vector of covariates there, or control variables includes age squared, female gender indicator variable, and motivated by the historical natural experiment, they estimate equation 1, which is there. Using 3 different samples, all observations in the sample, descendants of Central Cuba and the Lele only, and descendants of the Bushong and the Lele only. Okay. We have just seen those estimates up there. What else I found interesting? Okay, causal channels. Let's see results. Cuba people teach less. Cuba people teach less. Okay. Or assume that institutions will teach values to their children. So that's an important. Oops, where is it? That's okay. Sorry about that. That's an important table for us to make sense of the results, because that gives us the channel, right? So that they can give us a sort of plausible explanation for the results they find. And the Cuba ethnicity indicator is always negative, and when it matters. So fraction of qualities that are viewed as being important to teach children at home, right? So that is the, this is awful. Fraction of qualities that are viewed as being important to teach children at home. And what those correlations are saying is that parents, descendants of the Cuba Kingdom nowadays, they tend to teach less of all those qualities. They explain those qualities. I think they explain those qualities in the note and also in the paper. But you can see that it's always a negative, right? Because Cuba descendants, they assume that those qualities of good behavior, right? This is science, this is not the Bible. Those qualities of good behavior, of rule following, will be inculcated by the state. So they are essentially, but then it's those qualities are not inculcated by the states, because there is very little state capacity in those regions where the Cuba Kingdom are nowadays, which is the DRC. What else I found interesting when I was checking this paper? Conclusions. They have investigated the impact of living under a centralized state on internal norms of rule following. Using two, how do they do that? Using two experimental measures of rule following, the resource allocation game, the RAG game, and the ultimatum game, the UG, with the potential for theft, and examining three samples motivated by the historical natural experiment. So the natural experiment here is essentially, folks, there are people who are descendants of the Cuba kingdom and people who just outside the kingdom who are not. Cuba descendants are less likely to follow rules and more likely to steal, right? This finding is consistent with recent models where endogenous investments to inculcate values in children decline when there is an increase in the effectiveness of formal institutions that enforce socially desirable behavior, right? So that's a plausible behavior if they were in a society with more state capacity. Consistent with such a mechanism, they found that Cuba parents feel that it's less important to teach their children values related to rule following because they assume that those values will be taught in school, right? Oops, those are the references. Usual names: Asemoglu, Alizina, Becker, Sasha Becker, right? Some bolds. Paulo Giuliano, Gianaioli, and Rainer. I have seen some of these papers already. Sarah Lewis, Galopoulos, Papaiwanum, Douglas North, Leighton. So you see that all these papers, all these people, they are working in a very similar sort of literature. All this literature on African development is related. All these people, they cite each other. Let me just stop sharing and see if there are questions, comments, suggestions. Questions? Let me see, folks, and if you come up with questions, let me see if there are any news for next week. Steve is here. Okay, so essentially Steve is saying that shouldn't be a problem. But now we need Cindy to organize things. So let's see. I'll let you know by tomorrow. If tomorrow is Wednesday, if you don't hear anything until Thursday, then we stick with Zoom. Questions, comments, suggestions, questions about the papers or questions about anything related to this course? All clear? Okay, if it's all clear, it's also all clear from my end. Let me stop recording.